of read alouds. We're just about to finish a book that we started a couple of weeks ago, The World According to Humphrey by Betty G. Birney. And it's about a hamster who lives in a classroom and has lots of adventures because his cage doesn't lock properly. So he's able to get in and out, and he tries to help kids in the classroom and the teacher because he's a good little hamster. We'll stop the read aloud till we finish this book, which I think is going to be probably Wednesday, and then we'll start up again in July with some new titles. And I hope you'll send me some ideas of things you'd like to hear me read aloud during the summer. You can email me at children@sopl.org. I'd be happy to take your suggestions or any other questions you have about summer and summer reading. We're getting ready. There will be summer reading this year, okay? It'll be a bit different, but it will happen. Okay, so let's read chapter. Now remember where we were. Humphrey went home with the Thomases, who were really, really noisy, and he figured out a way to stop all the noise in the house. They watched television like 24/7. He got out of his cage and went behind the TV and somehow yanked the cord out. And they just thought the TV was broken. They didn't realize that Humphrey had done this. Also, what's happening now is Garth, who is the class bully, has started to explain why he's being so mean to Humphrey. He's having some problems at home. His mom is sick, and he's upset because he would like to bring Humphrey home with him for the weekend, but he knows it's probably not a good idea because of his mom being sick. Mrs. Brisbane, the teacher, is trying to help him work that out. So let's see what's happening. Chapter 12, Peace Breaks Out. Early in the evening, Ty, Dealey, and AJ raced downstairs and played Crazy Eights. Later, they ran outside and threw a football around the yard. The Thomases were having breakfast with Bo when the telephone rang. Mr. Thomas talked for a few minutes, mostly saying, that's fine. Okay, he hung up and he said, we're going to have a visitor, but don't tell AJ. Oh, a mystery, thought Humphrey. I love mysteries because they're fun to solve. Then again, I don't like mysteries because I don't like not knowing what's going on. So I waited and waited. I'm with Humphrey. I like mysteries too, but I like to know what's going on. The sooner the better. A few hours later, the doorbell rang. The visitor turned out to be Garth. That's the class bully, and he and AJ used to be friends, and they're having problems in their friendship now. The visitor turned out to be Garth Tugwell and his father. I really appreciate this, Mr. Tugwell told the Thomases. It was Mrs. Brisbane's idea. Since Garth can't have Humphrey at our house right now because Garth's mom is sick, she suggested that AJ could take care of him over here. He could help AJ take care of him over here while he's at your house for the weekend. That sounds like Mrs. Brisbane, I thought, as if I'm trouble to take care of. But Garth had been crying because he couldn't have me, so maybe she was trying to be nice. After Mr. Tugwell left, Mr. Thomas called AJ in. AJ ran into the room and practically backed out again when he saw Garth because Garth has not been a good friend to him lately. We have a guest, said Mr. Thomas. Shake hands, Anthony. Garth is here to help you take care of Humphrey. The two boys shook hands reluctantly. How come? Asked AJ. Garth just shrugged his shoulders and he said, well, Mrs. Brisbane said too. Well, come on, we'll clean out his cage and get it over with. The boys didn't talk much while they cleaned the cage, but then they started giggling when they cleaned up my potty corner. I don't know why that makes everyone giggle. After they stopped giggling, they started talking and kidding around. They decided to let me out of the cage. So they took a set of old blocks and they made a huge maze for me. Oh, I love mazes. When we got tired of that game, AJ offered to teach Garth how to play crazy eights. And guess what? Nobody mentioned the TV. Nobody shot anybody with rubber bands, which is what Garth was doing in the classroom. Later that afternoon, the kids all went outside to play football. I was fast asleep until Mrs. Thomas came into the den with a broom and started sweeping. A minute later, Mr. Thomas came in. "What are you doing, hon?" "What does it look like I'm doing? I'm sweeping. You know, all the snacking we do makes a real mess on the floor." "Is the baby asleep?" "Yes." Mr. Thomas walked over to his wife and he took the broom away from her. And he said, "You know what? You sit down and rest for a while. I'll sweep." Mrs. Thomas smiled and thanked him and sat down on the couch. Mr. Thomas swept all around the outside of the room, even behind the TV. When he got there, he stopped sweeping and he leaned over. Now remember what Humphrey did behind the TV. He pulled the plug out. "Well, I'll be," he said. "What's wrong?" "The TV is unplugged," he said. "It's unplugged." He came out from behind the TV, plug in hand, and a very puzzled look on his face. "But how did it come unplugged while we were just sitting there watching?" He said, "A plug doesn't just fall out." "Well, plug it in," his wife said. Well, you guessed it, that TV came on, so bright and loud as ever. "I don't get it," said Mr. Thomas, "but at least we don't have to pay someone to get it fixed." Mrs. Thomas stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then she glanced out the window at the kids playing happily outside. "Charlie, what do you say we keep it unplugged for a couple more days? We just won't tell the kids." Mr. Thomas grinned, and then he bent down and he unplugged the TV. Couldn't hurt, because while the TV was unplugged, the family started playing board games together. The kids went outside to play. They were having way too much TV time. He put down the broom and he sat on the couch near his wife, and the two of them just sat there giggling. And Mr. Thomas looked over at me and said, "You don't want a little peace and quiet, do you, Humphrey?" And I squeaked, "No, no, no." And then I fell asleep. Remember, he's nocturnal, so he needs to sleep during the daytime. Things were a lot better when AJ, Garth, and I returned to school. There were no rubber bands flying through the air. Garth didn't try to trip anybody or make fun of anybody. That meant there wasn't a lot of giggling in the classroom. Heidi didn't get to be a tattletale, and Garth was just trying to behave himself. But the best change was Sarah, who did start raising her hand every single day. One day she raised her hand to volunteer to stay in during recess to clean the blackboard. Miranda raised her hand too. Mrs. Brisbane chose them both. "Girls, I think I can trust you here while I run this report to the principal's office." Of course she could trust them. Once the girls were alone, they began to talk. "I really liked your singing," Miranda said to Sarah. "Thanks. My mom and I are going to see a musical version of Cinderella over at the college this weekend. We have an extra ticket. Would you like to come with us?" Oh, Sarah said, "Yes. I've never been to a play before." "Okay, I'll have my mom call your mom." And then Sarah's face fell. "Oh, better not. Give me your number and I'll have my dad call your mother." "Okay, cool." That was it. Miranda jotted down her number and Sarah took it. I knew that Miranda's mother didn't care how well Sarah's mother spoke English. Maybe Sarah could figure that out. Another great thing that happened was Mrs. Brisbane started reading a book out loud to the class, just like I'm reading to you. Sometimes I doze right through these sessions, but this time she picked out a really good book. When she announced that it was about a mouse, Gail giggled. "What did she say?" Art whispered to Richie. "Pay attention, Art," Mrs. Brisbane said. "It's about a mouse." Several of the boys groaned. "That's baby stuff." "We'll see," Mrs. Brisbane told them, and she started to read. And what a tale it was. All about mice no bigger than I am who were great warriors. I was longing to put on some armor myself by the time she stopped reading. I bet these are books by Brian Jakes that she's reading to the class. These are books we have in the library too. Tomorrow, more. Continue tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow? Well, that woman truly has a mean streak. She's proved it again and again. I would have sneaked right out of my cage to finish that book. But she's so mean, she stuck it in her desk drawer. The weekend came around quickly, and I was going home with Richie. I'm not quite sure how many people actually live at the Rinaldi's house because there were always so many people coming and going. Aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents and neighbors. One meal seemed to flow right into the next, and Richie's mom was very generous with treats. I'll tell you one thing, you can never be lonely or hungry at the Rinaldi's house. On Sunday afternoon, guess who showed up? Remember who Richie's uncle is? Aldo, the janitor at the school. Aldo is not lonely because he brought along his girlfriend Maria to meet the family. She was a very nice lady who wore her hair piled up in a bun on top of her head, and she was dressed in bright red. Red earrings, red sweater, red skirt, and red shoes. I think red is a very happy color. Maria seems like a very happy person. All the family made a big fuss over Maria, and she had brought cookies and breads, and they praised the gifts she brought to them. She does work in a bakery. After all the commotion of their arrival died down, I heard Aldo tell Maria, now there's somebody really important I want you to meet. And he introduced Maria to me. Believe it or not, Humphrey's one of my best friends, and he was the very first friend I told about you. Well, Maria said to me, I'm honored to meet you, Humphrey. And he squeaked at me, Maria said. The pleasure is all mine, I squeaked. See, he likes you. And indeed, I did. The world seemed like a pretty nice place for a handsome young hamster like me. I can tell you I was sitting on top of the world when I returned to room 26 on Monday. But I just about toppled off when Mrs. Brisbane made an alarming announcement. Class, as you know, this will be a short week in school due to Thanksgiving, and that means Humphrey will need a home for 4 days instead of 2. Now, who wants to volunteer for that? Well, that's a big job, to have a hamster come to your house for 4 days. You won't believe what I'm going to say. Not one hand went up. I actually almost fell off my wheel. Mrs. Brisbane was surprised too. Know what she said? Heidi, didn't you want to take Humphrey home? Yes, but we're going away to my grandma's house for Thanksgiving. Art, didn't you want Humphrey last week? Yes, but we're traveling for Thanksgiving. My mom says this isn't a good time. Every classmate had big plans. I was worried. I didn't want to spend 4 days alone in the classroom. And I worried all day Monday, I worried all day Tuesday, and I worried even more on Wednesday, because at the end of the day, I knew somebody had to take me home. At the end of the day, Principal Morales stopped by to give Mrs. Brisbane an envelope. I think it was her paycheck, because she was very glad to see him, and she said, I have a huge favor to ask. Sure, Sue, what is it? Asked the principal. Could you take Humphrey home for the weekend? I had my paws crossed that he'd say yes, but he didn't even smile. Oh, we're going out of town for the holiday. Another time I would. Another time wouldn't matter, thought Humphrey. I need a place to go now. Guess what? Mrs. Brisbane picked up her papers and turned to me and she said, well, Humphrey, it looks like you're going home with me for Thanksgiving. And she said it in a grim, not happy voice. My fate was sealed. I was going to the home of the woman who once said she wanted to get rid of me for 4 whole days. And frankly, to tell you the truth, I was worried I'd never come back to the class. 26. Next page. Next chapter, chapter 13. Thanks, but no thanks. Since Mrs. Brisbane didn't say a word to me on the drive home, I had time to think about the last few months. I had not had a bad experience with any of the families I had visited. In fact, they had all been gracious and welcoming, except Miranda's dog, Clem. But I knew how to handle him. In return, I lent them a helping paw here and there. After all, you can learn a lot about yourself by getting to know another species. I was overdue for trouble, and I was likely to get it at Brisbane's House of Horrors. That's what I thought. That's how I pictured her house, that it would be decorated with skeletons and bats and scary jack-o'-lanterns, even though it wasn't Halloween. I was shivering at the picture I had in mind when Mrs. Brisbane spoke. Humphrey, I need you like I need a hole in the head. And I squeaked back, the same to you. I don't know what Bert is going to say about you, but whatever it is, it won't be good. Nothing he says lately is pleasant. Bert? Who's Bert? Then I realized it must be her husband, the one who's sick. Well, I certainly am not looking forward to meeting him. It won't be much of a Thanksgiving, she said, but we don't have much to be thankful for this year, but I'll try. Good for you, I squeaked. She almost smiled. Thanks for the support. The house was yellow with white shutters and lots of big trees, and all the fall leaves had covered the front yard. Lots of nice colors, gold and red. And on top of everything else, Mrs. Brisbane said, I have to rake. Inside, the house was very cozy. Lots of pretty pictures on the walls and some big yellow flowers in a vase on the table. Bert, I'm home, Mrs. Brisbane said. A few seconds later, an old man rolled into the room in a wheelchair. His gray hair was uncombed and stuck out in places it shouldn't. His chin was covered with a gray stubble of a beard, and he had very wrinkled pajamas on. His expression was so sour, he looked as if he just drank a glass of vinegar. Mrs. Brisbane put my cage on the low coffee table. We have a guest for the weekend, Bert. I could tell her she was trying hard to sound cheery. His name is Humphrey. Mr. Brisbane sneered. This is unacceptable. For the little pay you get from that school, you have to be forced to spend your weekend babysitting a rat? Well, he really is nasty. I bit my tongue to keep from saying something unsqueakably bad. They're not forcing me, said Mrs. Brisbane. It's just that no one else can do it. Please, let's not make a mountain out of a molehill. Pardon me, but I resented being called a molehill almost as much as I resented being called a rat. Mrs. Brisbane changed the subject. I thought you were going to get dressed today and not stay in your pajamas all day. Why should I, said Bert. I'm not going to see anybody, except you and that rat. Mrs. Brisbane got up and walked out of the room. Boy, nobody in room 26 could get away with talking to Mrs. Brisbane like that. I wished I could send her husband to the principal's office. Everything was really quiet around the house. Mrs. Brisbane moved my cage onto a card table in the middle of the living room, and then she sat down and read The Guide to the Care and Feeding of Hamsters and the chart my classmates had kept on me. Looks like your friends have been taking good care of you, she said. Very, 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 very good, I squeaked. She fed me and gave me clean water, and then she and Mr. Brisbane ate dinner in some other room while they watched TV, and they went to bed early. I'll bet they didn't say 2 words to each other. Even Mrs. Mack, who lived at home, talked more than they did. The next morning, Mrs. Brisbane was up very early, and soon the house smelled yummy. I thought maybe I'd like this Thanksgiving thing after all. What I didn't like about Thanksgiving was Mr. Brisbane. While Mrs. Brisbane was clattering pots and clinking pans and making things smell good, he sat in his wheelchair in the living room and just frowned. After a while, he called into the kitchen, "Sue, why don't you stop all that cooking and just sit down for a minute?" Mrs. Brisbane popped her head out the door and said, "It won't be Thanksgiving without turkey and all the trimmings." Then Mr. Brisbane said he didn't have anything to be thankful for. Mrs. Brisbane went back in the kitchen and banged around some pots and pans again. That sour expression on the old man's face was really starting to get to me, so I decided to take a little spin on my wheel. I really got that thing going at high speed. I was going so fast, I couldn't see whether Mr. Brisbane was smiling or frowning. Finally, Mrs. Brisbane came into the room to sit down. "Would you look at that, Sue?" her husband asked. And he pointed to me on my wheel. "Oh, he does that all the time," she said. "Just spinning his wheels like me. Stuck in a cage and going nowhere," said Mr. Brisbane. His voice was so grim, I stopped spinning. Oof, I was a little dizzy. "You're wrong, Bert," said Mrs. Brisbane. "Humphrey's not stuck. He goes everywhere. Every weekend he goes to another house. He eats different foods, he gets out of the cage, and he runs through mazes. He runs and jumps and climbs. You, Bert, are the ones spinning your wheels and going nowhere. You're stuck in a cage, but it's a cage you made." Wow, you could have knocked me over with a feather when I heard Mrs. Brisbane talk that way. Mr. Brisbane was surprised too. "Do you think I wanted that car to hit me? Do you think that was my choice?" "Of course not, Bert. I'm so grateful you lived through it. That's the point. You're alive, but you sure don't act like it." With that, Mrs. Brisbane got up and went back into the kitchen. Meanwhile, Mr. Brisbane scowled and frowned and glared. Finally, Mrs. Brisbane put the food on the dining room table, and I watched them eating their dinner from my cage. They ate, but they didn't say much. Finally, Mr. Brisbane said, "This food is delicious, Sue." That's the nicest thing I'd heard him say so far. "Thank you," said Mrs. Brisbane. There was silence for a while, and then Mr. Brisbane said, "Just think, last year after Thanksgiving dinner, Jason and I threw the football around the backyard. Now I'm stuck here, and Jason is in Tokyo. Why don't we call him, Bert?" "It's too early there. We'll have to call later." Football, Jason, Tokyo. You can learn a lot if you stop spinning and start listening. I listened late that night when they called Jason, who turned out to be their grown-up son who was working in Tokyo, which is far, far away. Boy, there were more Mrs. Brisbanes than I'd ever dreamed. One was a mean one to me. One was a nice one to students. One was a wife. Another was a mother. One was a cook. One wore dark pantsuits. The other wore jeans. But which was the real Mrs. Brisbane? That night, as I headed out of the living room and toward the bedroom, I heard Mrs. Brisbane, the wife, say, "I know you think I'm being hard on you, Bert, but it really is time for you to think about what you're going to do with the rest of your life." Mr. Brisbane didn't answer. All right, so that's 2 chapters that we've read, and I'll be back on Wednesday to read chapter 14, Hide and Go Squeak. Okay, I hope everybody gets outside today because it's a really beautiful day. Hop on your bikes and go for a ride. Put your helmet on and practice social distance and wear your mask when it's asked of you, going into stores or being with friends that you haven't seen in a while. Okay, see you Wednesday.